I need a horse.
We don't have horses, just dogs, cats, birds.
And give me one of those large enough to ride.
Welcome, Gothamites, to another episode of the Arkham Sessions. My name is Brian Ward. With me, as always, the psychologist to the superheroes, superheroines, and supervillains of Gotham City, and now the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Dr. Drea Letamendi. Hello, Drea.
Hi, Brian.
We've been getting a lot of fantastic feedback on our MCU analysis so far. We're 3 movies in. We've done Iron Man, The Incredible Hulk, and Iron Man 2. Drea, how do you feel so far going on our path to the Avengers Endgame and even further with a couple of the Marvel TV series?
I think there's some elements that are becoming memorable for me. Mm-hmm. We certainly are not, to my knowledge, I don't think we're repeating some of our Batman themes. I think we've realized there's just a lot to cover.
Yeah.
And it's not as if there are absolutely brand new topics, but there's a twist on some of the topics. So if we're revisiting trauma, for instance, it's not really centering around the trauma that we're used to. For instance, Batman's parental loss and living in Gotham City and all that entails. These heroes are different. I mean, we're talking about Thor today. He is a god. Mm-hmm. So we have to adjust our perspectives and think about psychology in different ways. So it's kind of like going into different territory and mapping on the psychology to those characters in what feels to me like a very new process, a more illuminating process compared to some of the topics we've revisited in the past.
Sure. Oh, that's you're absolutely right. We've got to take these same ideas and apply them to someone who is God adjacent. So that is a whole new sort of thing. Although it's not entirely new. You just did an incredible take on the Loki character that went through all of Loki's appearances up until his TV series. You are going to have the hardest time not referring back to that as we talk about Loki probably in this movie, because obviously you know a whole lot more that happens to him throughout the course of the movies. But I'm going to keep you honest on this one.
Okay.
We're only going to talk about what happened in the first Thor movie from 2011. Before we do that, I just want to do a really quick plug. And he didn't know I was going to do this, and Drea, you didn't even know I was going to do this, but I think it's worth mentioning. I just finished reading The Crimson Wraith, Legacy of the Hood by one of our patrons, J. Griffin Hughes. He sent us a free copy, and it really wasn't until I read the acknowledgments that I found out why. In the acknowledgments, he includes us. He thanks us in the beginning of the book, the work of Brian Ward and Dr. Andrea Letamendi, whose Arkham Sessions podcast provided excellent insight into the psychology of masked vigilantes and their adversaries. So, Drea, you're actually doing a significant amount of consulting just by doing this podcast.
That's fantastic.
But it's a fun book. It's a really fun book. It's a hefty sized book, actually. I think it actually collects 4 different digital novellas, which he then compiled into a single book. But it's all about a girl named Gracie who basically, it's sort of like if Jason Todd were wandering the city of Gotham and came across Batman and Robin, but if Batman and Robin actually were still sort of the 80-year version of themselves. Like, it's a really good way of saying Batman doesn't reinvent every few years. Like, this is the same Bruce Wayne from 80 years ago, and he has to solve a mystery with Gracie's help that sort of unlocks mysteries of the last 80 years of his career as a crime fighter. So it's a really fun take on this idea of superheroes who have existed for multiple decades. I would recommend it. Go find The Crimson Wraith, Legacy of the Hood by J. Griffin Hughes. And again, that's not really an ad. He didn't ask us to say anything. I just finished reading it and thought I would mention it. Also, I want to give a quick happy birthday to my mom. Today is her birthday. So happy birthday, Mom. This episode is for you. I know my dad will be listening, so I'm sure he will let her know that we wished her a happy birthday. Let's talk about Thor, Drea.
We should dedicate Thor to your mom, like our discussion.
Yeah.
Of Thor.
She is worthy of Thor. Thor isn't even worthy of Thor at the beginning of this film. You know what's interesting? I think, especially early on in the in Marvel's history of the films, they were hiring almost sort of auteur level. I mean, Jon Favreau was in charge of the first 2 Iron Man movies. Kenneth Branagh came on to do Thor. And
I actually did not know this.
You didn't know Branagh did Thor?
No. I didn't think about it until many years later.
Yeah, but it makes perfect sense. I mean, let's be honest. Very early on, Guillermo del Toro was actually attached to Thor. And to some degree, that makes sense when you're talking about godlike monsters and you're talking about this hero, this Norse mythology turned superhero. But Del Toro left the film in order to direct the Hobbit movies, which ironically he didn't end up directing. And they brought on Kenneth Branagh. Now this is perfect because Branagh brought this sense of Shakespearean tragedy to the story of Thor and Loki and Odin. And I really think that he's the perfect person to tackle at least an origin story of this character and these Asgardians. Especially if you're not familiar with Kenneth Branagh, basically if there's a good version from the 20th century or the 21st century of a Shakespearean movie, Kenneth Branagh probably had something to do with it. One of my all-time favorites, Much Ado About Nothing. So Branagh...
I'm so quiet because I'm not much of
You're not a big Shakespearean.
No.
Well, but he also did Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Not a great movie. I mean, it's okay. It's
that was fantastic.
It tries to be the book, but it's a bit grandiose.
It's very over the top, which I kind of like. When
you've got De Niro as the monster, you're going to have it. He also did a movie called Dead Again with his then wife Emma Thompson, which is an incredible murder mystery. Love that movie. And you would probably like that movie, Drea, because there's sort of a 2 different time period sort of thing happening. So that's interesting. Anyway, Branagh came on and lent his experience with the sort of Shakespearean quality to the Asgardians. We're introduced to Thor right off the bat through a giant battle. And you really get this sense of super cocky hero. He's not even really, I don't know if he's a hero. He's not really an anti-hero. He's just sort of a guy who lives to pick fights because he's got this sense of entitlement. He is the crown prince of Asgard. He knows that he will ascend to the throne when his father Odin either retires or dies. Presumably that could be soon-ish. Odin's getting on in years, played by Anthony Hopkins. And so Thor really does just have this sense of royal entitlement that can be matched by no other. Even if Odin tells him not to pick fights, Thor's going to do it because he's just this brat. And for the first time, I want to get your thought on this. For the first time, really, you know how when we were talking about Iron Man, I said that Tony is kind of who he presents as. I think, he's pretty close and you said that you still thought there was a little being held back. And of course, he does let that guard down occasionally, especially with those around him like Pepper Potts. Thor is probably the very first character I can think of in a really long time that is just genuinely exactly who he presents to be. I don't think there's any pretense in Thor. I think in the very beginning, he's super cocky. He wears every emotion he has on his sleeve. When he feels entitled, he lets you know it. When he's feeling cocky, he lets you know it. When he feels like something has been taken away from him, like he will later on in the film, such as his crown, his pending crown, he lets you know it. He gets very bratty and
he's
kicks and screams.
He's not exactly very likable in the beginning of the film. And
it's those blonde eyebrows.
Well, yeah, and it's a wig, right?
And probably, and really bad. I mean, this is before they really just kind of let Chris Hemsworth like be Chris Hemsworth.
Thing.
Like he's got a really bad blonde beard and wig.
It is in a very fantasy realm, and he looks like a fantasy character. You're right. I don't sense that he's hiding, or even that there's a secondary set of emotions happening behind the confidence and the entitlement. And there's not necessarily anything outwardly wrong with that or pathological or problematic. It's just that this is who he is. And I think the best way to characterize him is to actually look at the people around him. And Loki is we'll soon find out, his adopted brother. They grew up believing that they were biological brothers and that Odin was their father. Nonetheless, it's really interesting that Loki, I'm already going to go into the psychology of Loki. Loki has always felt less than. He has felt weaker. He has felt in the shadow. He's felt eclipsed in the shadow of Thor.
Yeah.
So I think it's easy to say Thor has always had this innate godlike quality to him. He's Asgardian.
Yeah.
Like there is a natural order to this. He is he's the way he looks is a very genetic, inborn quality. And then he walks the walk. And the reality is that Loki desires that level of power, that level of authority. Just the fact that Thor doesn't really even have to work for it is absolutely infuriating for Loki.
Yeah.
And so as children, and we get just a small sample of what their childhood was like, as children, Loki is attempting over and over again to be as strong, as godlike, as brave as Thor, but ultimately that's just not who he is. He happens to be quite intellectual. He happens to be quite cunning. He later becomes mischievous, which is seen by many people as a negative quality. But behind that mischief is a variety of positive characteristics, like being able to read other people, having good social skills, being quite smart. I mean, there's all these things you could say about him. So it's not as if Loki grew up with weaknesses and deficits. It's just that he didn't have the qualities that were valued in society and certainly by the family. And that dynamic of that sort of created the core of later their relationship.
And it's interesting because it's almost like he does have the qualities that are desired in Asgard. Certainly Odin looks at him and realizes his potential as a brain, as a wonderful thinker. Of course, Odin knows something that we don't know, which is that he is not Asgardian blood. He is not even Odin's blood. And their mother also takes to Loki, but you almost get the sense that if he were just provided with the same amount of attention, the same amount of encouragement, the same amount of love that went into raising Thor to be the future king, the two of them could be a formidable duo, whether you've got Thor's brute strength or Loki's mind, they could have been amazing rulers together of Asgard. You really couldn't have found a better team. And I almost get the sense that the two of them could have been the absolute best of friends as well as brothers, should they had just been treated the same. I want to talk about Thor for a second. Again, you got this guy who wears every emotion on his sleeve. And as a result of his going against Odin's wishes and it ultimately leading to an attack on Asgard, Thor is banished by Odin and is sent to Earth without powers, without Mjolnir, without the worthiness that it would take to wield Mjolnir, even though Mjolnir is sitting there in a giant crevice in the earth. No one can lift it because no one is worthy. It's almost as if Odin has been dangling this carrot in front of Thor. We see the object that he would most want, and it's right there. He can't pick it up. Drea, this would have been a really great opportunity to investigate being stripped of your privilege. And I think if there's one disappointment I have in this movie, it's that we don't explore that enough. We see Thor be humbled to some degree a couple of times, but he really makes the transformation from powerful god full of hubris to humble earthling in really just a matter of, like, what, a day or two? It's a couple of days. What did you think about that transformation?
Right, and he's still seen by humans as godlike.
Yes.
People are in awe of him. His physique and his mannerisms are godlike, and his personality is pretty intact, which is, I think you're right. There's the discovery of some like lacking, what it's like to lack a power, or especially an attribute that defined him.
Yeah.
He very much aligned with the idea that he is incredibly strong and pretty much the most powerful being. And to not have that particular attribute, really did change his framework about his sense of self. Mm-hmm. But I think you're right. I don't remember seeing him really having thoughtful conversations or discussions or having moments where he's really considering what it's like to lack. Mm-hmm. And he really aligned with this superpower he had, that defined him. I think, of course, we see this later. We're not allowed to talk about it, but of course we see this later on in the future or in the past. Yeah. But for now, he is, you're right, he's humbled. He's trying to figure out how to be himself without this attribute, without the ability to just literally smash or superpower his way out of a situation. Mm-hmm. And I also think that we're meant to understand him as not a very intellectual person. Yeah. Right? There's some of the humor about Thor, especially in this movie, is establishing him as shallow. Yeah. He's not a very deep character. No. And this is a very ongoing joke. We were just at Disneyland the other day, and the show, I don't want to give too much away, but there is a Doctor Strange show, and Thor appears, and the whole joke. In
that version, my assumption is that it could be a different person each time.
Okay. Yeah. In the one we saw, the actor, the theme park character of Thor shows up, and we laugh because he's kind of adult.
Yeah. Sorry, I thought you said an adult. And I'm like, did you want a child Thor?
No, he's not.
adult.
He's shallow.
Yes.
And that's the joke.
Yeah.
And again, we see some depth later, but this means that most of the first Thor movie in losing his power and kind of fumbling around Earth is, yes, it's a very humbling experience, but becomes a bit of the theme seems to be the I don't know, the punchline here is that he's a fish out of water.
Yeah.
And you know more about mythology than I do. I think the whole losing your weapon, losing your power is a thing, right?
Yeah,
this
sure.
is a trope
Sure.
that is meant to teach us a story
Yes.
or teach us a lesson.
Yeah. Yeah. And in this case, it's not even so much as weapon. I mean, you're right. But it really symbolizes just sort of losing your worthiness.
And falling to earth.
Yeah.
I think in mythology, falling to earth and being among humans is insulting. It's a blow to the ego.
Oh, 100%. It's one thing to go to Earth. It's one thing to not be able to go back to your heaven, to Asgard in this case. He's effectively been banished. I want to ask you about Odin because you've got a father who has believed that he was doing the right thing and that he was raising this son to be an even better king than himself. He took on another child from an arch enemy, a child that was ignored and left to die because it was tiny, from his enemy Laufey, and raised that child as his own son, that of course being Loki, only to then have to banish his true son, his elder son, from Asgard. And you can see that it really does a significant amount of emotional damage to Odin to do so. Talk a little bit about that. I mean, about this idea of parenting and realizing your children are not who you're bringing them up to be or trying to bring them up to be, and maybe even taking on the burden of maybe this was always my fault. Maybe I raised you to be this way.
Well, that is a tough one. And I think that one of his, I don't think it's a failure of his as a parent. I would never say something like that, but maybe something that he got a little carried away with was trying to raise his sons with a broad stroke, with very similar expectations. And it's very clear that they have different abilities, different personalities. Odin knows that Loki is a descendant of the frost giants. And genetically, that means something very different in terms of how he would be raised. I found it very fascinating, just as a side note, that Loki, of course, is a shape shifter. And so I don't truly understand the complexity of his magic, but I believe he can probably look any way he wants to. But his natural state is much like fits in with Asgardians to some degree. So he's able to pass as an Asgardian, and he lives most of his life not knowing he's actually a descendant of the frost giants. We'll get into that in a bit. And what Odin chooses to do, just as far as banishing Thor and stripping him of his power, is something that can be reasonable. I don't think that's an extreme decision. And I think there's some higher level expectation there that he knows it's a test, right? This is, Thor needs to earn he needs to become worthy. And Thor has become, unfortunately, he has been treated in a way that has led him to believe that he just is worthy. He just naturally is worthy. And that is very dangerous. That's a very dangerous attribute, but it also means that Odin has to put him to the test and really kind of put him in a situation where he has setbacks. He has to grow and learn. He has to better understand what it even means to be worthy.
Yeah.
And I think that becomes really kind of the core of this film.
So then let's go into Loki. You've written, as we mentioned earlier, you've written an analysis on Loki, the character, leading all the way up to Endgame, or I should say, Infinity War.
Yeah.
But you are now having to start from scratch and look strictly at Loki in this film. He's a character who has always been mischievous, whose mother Frigga taught him magic and has nurtured that quality in him. But he uses it more for mischievous means, and he is constantly in the shadow of his older, bigger, more brutish brother. And in fact, probably looks down on Thor simply for being a brute while he is clearly the one with the intelligence. And probably sees himself as a more worthy ruler of Asgard in the future than Thor, who is just sort of hell-bent on war and brute strength winning the day.
Yeah. And look, this first Thor movie is not too remarkable. It's fine. It really builds these characters. It introduces you to who you need to know. Mm-hmm. The family aspects are really important here. This is going to come into play later. So there isn't much to criticize about the film, but I would say one of my favorite things about this particular film in the MCU is that it really has us think about this concept of value and worthiness.
Yeah.
And it does so through this mythological story that should be very familiar for most of us. And I like that. I like that it's telling us, look, on paper, you're supposed to believe that someone like Loki is a villain mm-hmm. and someone like Thor is good. And you struggle through that because you see that, Thor, he's imperfect. He's a bit blinded by his ego. He is, we're meant to get a little bit wrapped up in his physique and his physical presence.
Sure.
And yet Loki is, on the sidelines, on the margins, slowly, gradually gaining our interest and our fascination. And they do this so well. It's great casting. It's really good writing. I think this is exactly what it needs to be. And again, this idea that we should second guess our concepts of worthiness mm-hmm. Vis-a-vis these sort of cultural markers. What does it mean to be good? And I think Loki naturally is subverting those expectations. Quite realistically, it makes sense. You should not betray people. You shouldn't lie to people. You shouldn't deceive people. You shouldn't be selfish in the mm-hmm. way that Loki is doing all these things. Mm-hmm. And so we're understanding that, okay, this is likely a villain. But then there are aspects that, again, pull us back into that questioning. But what if you are different than other people? What if you actually are? I think this is reaching out to those of us who were the smaller ones, were the weaker ones, but physically or in other ways. But what if we're actually bright and scrappy and intelligent and intuitive? What about these other markers of strengths that kind of get marginalized? Mm-hmm. And I think that this is a way to get us into that discourse and a way to show us that, again, which Marvel does really well, not every villain is a villain, right? Yeah.
Well, it plays into that. It plays into that idea that no villain is a villain in their own mind. That they always have motivation, they always have purpose, and they always see themselves as as being characters who are right in their own minds.
Yeah, and that's a great point too. And you have to think about what Loki has been through. It's a really nice study of family dynamics, right? Thor has been through some changes in Asgard, but for the most part, a pretty consistent upbringing. Loki, as you mentioned, his parents know he's adopted. So there may have been some subtle ways in which he was told he was different.
Yeah.
And that's true. That's true of families who have adopted children. Whether they know they're adopted or not, there can be subtle parenting styles that give way to feeling different. And they could look different. And looking different is one way in which they develop a sense of self.
Yeah.
Sometimes a sense of self-doubt, a sense of imposter syndrome, or sort of a sense that Loki has. What do I have to do to feel like I belong in this family? And to speak to experiences, I think one of the most profound moments, one of the scenes in this film that certainly caught me emotionally, was when Loki discovers that he is not only that he's not a part of this family that he's adopted, but he happens to be a descendant of these historical enemies, the frost giants.
Right.
It's while he and Thor and Sif and the Warriors 3 are over, they've traveled through the Bifrost and they're in the frost giants planet. They're on the frost giants planet, and in battle, Loki is touched by a frost giant and notices that his body reacts to that.
Yeah, he begins to turn blue.
Yeah. And that's when that little hint, or a little, almost like a memory or something, starts to...
Certainly a suspicion.
It starts to kind of scratch at him.
Yeah.
And he then later is exploring... What is it? The tomb. It's like a little museum that Odin has.
Collection of artifacts and trophies and other worldly weapons that should not be in the hands of others.
Yeah, and that's where he and Odin have a confrontation. That's the scene I'm talking about. That's where I feel like Loki momentarily sheds this exterior.
Yeah, I have that audio. Would you like me to play it for you?
Let's listen to that.
Okay.
Am I cursed?
No.
What am I?
You're my son.
What more than that? The casket wasn't the only thing you took from Jotunheim that day, was it?
No. In the aftermath of the battle, I went into the temple and I found a baby. Small for a giant's offspring, abandoned, suffering, left to die. Laufey's son.
Laufey's son?
Yes.
Why? You were knee-deep in Jotun blood. Why would you take me?
You were an innocent child.
No. You took me for a purpose. What was it? Tell me!
I thought we could unite our kingdoms one day, bring about an alliance, bring about a permanent peace through you. But those plans no longer matter.
So I am no more than another stolen relic, locked up here until you might have use of me.
Why'd you twist my words?
You could have told me what I was from the beginning. Why didn't you?
You're my son. I wanted only to protect you from the truth.
What, because I'm the monster parents tell their children about at night? You know, it all makes sense now why you favored Thor all these years. Because no matter how much you claim to love me, you could never have a frost giant sitting on the throne of Asgard.
You can't really blame Odin for his reaction. He had really good intentions. He saved Loki's life.
Yeah.
But it's heartbreaking. And this is confirming for Loki that he, for one, I mean, there's two traumas here. One is that his birth family rejected him, that his father, I mean, there's a lot of sort of paternal storytelling here, that his biological father abandoned him. Mm-hmm. And so his first experience in life is abandonment. And then the second trauma is, in fact, this discovery, which is shattering to the sense of self. Like, this entire time, I thought, you know, you raised me to believe that I was Asgardian.
Yeah.
Among the 9 realms, I am in the you know, on the planet that is that it reigns over all the other 9 realms, that I'm a part of you, I'm a part of this family, and that's all been a lie. So he feels what he should feel, which is a sense of betrayal, a sense of rejection, not knowing who he is. And I think his reaction is totally appropriate.
And when he finds out that he is the son of Laufey, he realizes that he actually should be king. He should be a king of a realm of his own. And I mean, he's taking out of account the fact that Laufey left him there to die. You know, so I don't even know if he would be a welcome king in Jotunheim, but he takes it upon himself to believe that this is my destiny. I was meant to be king. By the way, we were talking a little bit about Kenneth Branagh and Branagh's own history with Shakespeare. Let's be very clear, and I think this scene is actually one of the scenes that illustrates it the most. This is absolutely King Lear.
Who's that?
Good Lord. I mean, I realize that you're not a Shakespeare fan by any stretch, but so in Lear, there's a character named Edmund, right? And Edmund is actually an illegitimate son of the Earl of Gloucester. And Edmund is constantly in the shadow of his other brother, who's Edgar. And Edmund, I mean, spoiler alert, actually convinces through trickery, you know, he has his brother banished. And this is exactly what we see Loki do. And so it's absolutely appropriate that Branagh was the one to direct these scenes, but it's scenes like this where Edmund is essentially confronting the Earl of Gloucester, and you know, you can absolutely see why they chose Branagh to take on these performances. Mm-hmm.
And I very much liked the majority of this film, and this scene in particular. It is a bit over the top, but
and by the way,
emotionally, it's really powerful.
So speaking of emotion and speaking of scenes with Odin and, you know, the father-son relationship, I've got another clip here that I want to play, and it's a similar clip, but it's actually the banishment scene, and there's a little bit of trivia that comes at the end of this. But let's take a listen to the words between father and son here in this moment.
The old ways are done. You'd stand giving speeches while Asgard falls.
You are a vain, greedy, cruel boy!
And you are an old man and a fool!
Yes. I was a fool. To think you were ready.
So an interesting little bit of trivia here, Drea. This reaction by Odin is actually improv. And when the crew was witnessing it on the set, on the day, everyone was basically sobbing because as Thor is yelling at Odin, Anthony Hopkins, is giving a very genuine reaction. And by the way, Anthony Hopkins has said in interviews that he very much was, it's the reason he took this role was the relationship between father and son, because his own relationship with his father was a very strained one. His father apparently was very cold to him and was constantly disappointed in him, expressed his disappointment in him because he wasn't a good student in school, and that he was a very fiery, hot-headed, very temperamental man, but never toward Hopkins. He was always just cold to him. And so he played very much, that relationship in these characters, or in these scenes. And so, yeah, there's a lot to love, if not for the plot and, the ease in which Thor reclaims Mjolnir ultimately. There's a lot to love in the performances of these characters.
Yeah, you almost start to care very little. I hate to frame it this way, but you don't care as much, let me put it that way. You don't care as much about some of the other relationships that are forming, in particular, of course, Jane Foster and Thor. That's such an important relationship. And I'm glad it gets sparked there. But I think you're right. I think really the heart of this movie is about the father-son and even the sort of the family unit dynamic, and the strength that comes from that, as well as the discord and even the disrepair, just sort of how things fall apart and need to be restored, and how that doesn't happen in a very smooth way, especially because of the way that history has influenced these characters, Loki in particular. There's a very good lesson here, right? You can be well-intentioned and you can do something that you think is promising for someone like Loki, but Loki's going to Loki, right? What do I mean? I mean, I know we're not allowed to talk about the Loki show, but what I love about the Loki show, just bear with me, give me 30 seconds on this, is that it has us pause and ask, what is a Loki? What are the fundamental aspects and attributes of this person? And how does, going back to this original, or this first Thor movie, how does this character form? How does this character become remarkable? How does this character become, unforgettable? And he does. So, yeah, I'm really less interested in some of the other relationships that are formed. Yeah.
And it's even sadder that, they aren't really, we can't talk about it, but there just isn't really a whole lot of progression between a lot of these characters, even as we move forward in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But we'll talk about those as we go. Ultimately, Drea, what did you think of Thor? Not the character, the movie. Film. Yeah. What were your ongoing thoughts? What were your takeaways, especially as a clinical psychologist reviewing this film? What did you think of the movie?
I think it's one of the stronger ones. It's not one of my favorites, but I do think in the first phase, on the heels of Iron Man 2 and Hulk, this is...
it was a relief to come back to a decent one. It's some good
energy. It's good God energy. Give us something a little bit different. So the timing on that was good. I think that the storytelling is great. And again, the introduction of Loki is really powerful. We're meant to question our relationship with this character. Why do we like him so much? He's making a lot of mistakes. He's making
so
a lot of poor decisions. Yeah, it's that combination, that balance of someone who is delightfully charming and charismatic and mischievous, and we kind of like that, and yet we also have a sense of pity.
Yeah.
And that pity is not to be underestimated. That pity surrounds his origin story. It surrounds his yearning to have significance. And you can't blame him. He's surrounded by people who are constantly talking about significance and power and reign. And, I said this in the article that I wrote, and I urge people to go look for it. When you're raised around so much culture, so much discourse and dialogue around power, around hierarchy, around, these concepts of what I would consider superiority even, naturally, you will start to wonder how you can have that. And you will yearn for it, and you will crave it, and you will see your shortcomings because you're, Loki isn't human, but we're human. So we can say, we see our shortcomings. We see our inability to reach these expectations. And I think that's really the story here, is that he was not able to see himself in, within that, within this, this framework. And so that led to him finding other pathways to be significant.
Yeah.
And he's quite good at it. So a really good story. The other thing, too, that I need to mention is that a lot of people were drawn to the adoption story, and that they related to the sense of trying to find yourself, trying to be identified as a part of a family, and just kind of the search for your origins. And I think there's some level of that here. What I don't like about it is that certainly the search for origins leads to nefarious things, that he was adopted from a community that's meant to be, they're the enemies. So I think that can be somewhat of a negative story to some people. And it really begs the question of whether adoption is a trauma. And this is something that comes up a lot in the psychology field, almost a debate. Is the process of adoption, simply being adopted, does that encompass trauma? Does that mean someone's experienced trauma? And the reality is, and certainly the research behind this demonstrates that it's not that simple. It's not that just because you were removed or transitioned from one family to another, or from child welfare services to an adoptive home, that doesn't necessarily mean your experience will be traumatic.
Right.
But there are so many really important factors to think about. And one of the most, I looked at some of the research recently, and one of the most important factors when we think about placement and outcomes is that the children who grew up to be happy and secure and had like a really healthy sense of self came from homes that were very welcoming to them. So we call this like a positive or stable placement. And they felt a sense of belonging and a strong sense of identifying with their family, regardless of if they were adopted, if they were returned to their biological family.
Yeah.
They looked at all these different situations. And I think that's really a helpful guiding light there. Like, okay, that's something to think about. No matter where you're placed, or no matter, where you have to go, as long as it's stable, secure, and gives you a sense of belonging, that's really important.
That's interesting.
And that's kind of where Odin fails a little bit.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, it's where his wife succeeds.
For sure.
But it is absolutely where Odin has failed. It's where Odin is drawn in by this idea of a biological heir. Is where he focuses all of his attention on the kid that will actually end up succeeding him one day. And not enough attention is paid to the other kid.
And Frigga did something really wonderful, which was to notice Loki's strengths and his interests. And she let that flourish. She taught him magic.
Yeah.
She let him be himself.
And I think we'll get more into this in Dark World. So
Okay.
So yeah, we'll hold on some of that. Frigate certainly plays a much bigger role in Dark World. So we will certainly talk about her. That's interesting though. It makes total sense. There's nothing that's surprising about that outcome, but it's nice to know that science actually backs it up.
Definitely. And I think it also uplifts this idea and supports people's experiences who had not felt like their transition from their biological family to their adoptive family, or even through the child welfare system, was negative or traumatic. Again, taking into account that there are so many factors here and that placements aren't necessarily linear. You can kind of go, actually many, I used to work in foster care. In many instances, there's a lot of transitioning and bouncing back and forth between the care system, the biological home or original home, and to an adoptive family, or even some foster families in between. And yes, those transitions, the more of them that there are and the less stable that they are, can be experienced as traumatic. So again, just kind of underscoring this idea that adoption itself, that's not the trauma. The experiences that might come with these transitions, that's what we really need to look at. And the stability of the adoptive home is truly important.
Well, Dre, this was a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to our next episode, which will cover Captain America, the First Avenger. And it might be one of the ones I've seen the least. Not because I didn't like it, but because for some strange reason, I just never watch the first Captain America movie all that often. So it'll be fun to go back and watch this movie with you. And hopefully we will have it up very soon. If you are a patron of ours, you'll actually get to hear our analysis even sooner. So go join Patreon. And while you're there, if you sign up with a $5 tier or higher, you get a shout out. So right now I'm going to shout those folks out: Weffy, Michael Pruitt, Christopher Bauer, Isaiah Atchin, Ian Stanton, Eric O'Sullivan, Zachary Hunter, Dr. Girlfriend, Maria Diego, Jay Griffin Hughes, Dr. Jerome Anderson, Samir Bhakta, our good friend Todd Stashwick, and of course my father, Carl Ward, are all $5 or higher tier patrons. They get shout outs. You can get your shout out by going to patreon.com/Arkham Sessions and joining us there. And we've also got, I've just convinced Drea to do something maybe pretty cool for our patrons. So join there and hopefully
Something I will obviously regret.
No, it's gonna be the best, and it's going to be a nice treat for our patrons. So go over there, check it out. In the meantime, Drea, why don't you tell folks where they can find you online?
You can find me on my website, drdreapsychology.com, or on social media, on Twitter and Instagram at Arkham Asylum Doc.
You can find me on Twitter. I am at bward028. On Instagram at b_ward028. You can find us both on Twitter at Arkham Sessions and on Instagram at the Arkham Sessions. And you can find us on Facebook, of course. Until next time, I'm Brian Ward.
I'm Dr. Drea Letamendi.
And together we are
The Arkham Sessions.
Another!